When you're looking at things like that, right, the whole pharmacogenetics element, which I think marries your genetics on the diagnostics use case and what doctors care about as a fundamental thing. How far do you think we are from a day where pretty much 80% of all ailments will require a doctor to look at a genetic report? Leaders in the microbiology and molecular biology world. Of course, genomics being a big thrust in everything that we do as a company. So we wanted to be able to share a lot of personal stories of our customers, of thought leaders in the industry, with the larger audience that we usually engage with. So we think that this niche that we are in, which is genomics, molecular diagnostics, clinical diagnostics as a larger ambit, and research, of course, much larger ambit, is fairly niche. And we think that there are not enough conversations happening online. So that's the reason why we sort of started this podcast.
Sure.
And we're super happy that you are one of the first few guests. It's a privilege to have you here. And welcome to Beyond the Bench. And tell us how your week was, because I know it's super busy and we caught you on a Friday. So just tell us, how was it?
Great week it was. Although I probably don't remember what happened on the Monday. I just know I was in Coimbatore yesterday and arrived this morning. Just a little bit of context of what the past has been like, and it's very different, right? So from when we started, it almost seems another century. How things were, and at that time, I think the idea was more just to be there like the rest of the world in terms of how genomics can be deployed for science, specifically for biological research. And now, there are hundreds of companies doing this. But there is still this little bit of, I think it's gone through this nice journey of the first few years, or maybe the first decade, of just embracing what the West had to give us, which is all of the sequencing
And this
technology.
was a decade, if you can point out for the viewers.
Maybe the 2000 to 2010,
10.
right, was essentially pretty much there was no genomics in India at that time.
Absolutely.
And the predecessor to NGS, I don't know whether you know, but microarrays were, right? They actually started that for sequencing, by the way. Right?
That's how the chip was made, essentially.
Right. And so having been part of a company that was actually developing, Dr. Raja has patents on this, and this was actually developing methods to make microarray chips a lot more, what would I say, affordable.
So this was more like a manufacturing of the chips itself.
It was actually a very smart design. So basically, when you capture the transcriptome of a cell, more than 50% is represented by high copy genes, right, which are like your housekeeping genes. Crowd the space, right? They take away all the protein machinery. So at those days, before the inkjet printing and Affymetrix guys came in, what people used to do was what's called as cDNA sequencing. So there was this company that was the largest collector of all human clones. And so what we were trying to do was, so Sanger sequencing was the only thing that was there.
That was already there.
So here's was a problem, that sequencing was still expensive. So remember, Sanger can do like what, 500 to 700 bases.
And if it takes time also.
Right. And if you have a transcriptome that is, say, a few million clones, and you need to sequence all of them, it's going to be horrendously expensive. So the idea was, how do I sift out? I just want one representative transcript for the high copy gene. Let's say GAPDH, right? There are 50,000 of them in my clone mix, and I just want to print one of them. So
on that location specific to that
sequence.
Right.
So the idea was to get rid of all the extra copies and make the mixture as unique as possible. So it can represent a higher diversity. And then what happens is, when you print it on the chip, you basically have unique clones rather than a higher representation of the high. So this method was basically to sort of get rid of all the high copy genes. Raja had called it prime and kill.
Prime and kill.
Yes. So
Wow.
basically, as the word describes, it was basically priming all the high copy genes and then using RNase H to sort of get rid of those high expressed genes.
Prime and Kill almost sounds like a episode name of a giant TV series that will unfold
No gun.
eventually. Yeah. And this was what year? Just
97, 98.
97. So that's like just 2000, as in 2000s were beginning and
Yes.
you're almost finishing your postdoc.
Yeah.
And so this was the project eventually he got a patent on.
Yes, he had a patent, and then of course that became a method. And this was in Quark Pharma, which eventually became a pharma company. But
Okay.
they were the first company to use genomics for drug discovery.
Oh, okay. And when was your first thought of starting a company came about?
I think I've been
Can you
asked this
pinpoint it?
question. No. So it's very strange. One can't say like, okay, I just woke up this morning and
Correct.
decided this is what it should be. I think many things contributed
Right.
to that path being what we chose. And one could have chosen the academic path, or try out being an entrepreneur. And I
Right.
think academic path was also equally hard at, very few institutions and not that many
Have
faculty
the funding
positions.
also, I think,
Right.
for specifically this piece of
Correct.
industry. Yeah.
Yeah. And having tested method development and the success of implementing that in the industry, I think gave the confidence that that's probably a better path to take.
Right.
And so it was an experiment, not decided, right?
So you want to just try and see what happens.
Yeah. And I think for the first 4-5 years, it was still perhaps there was a plan B somewhere lurking behind. But yeah, thankfully things did work out. I think we're really grateful that institutions like ISC gave us support. We incubated there.
So this was what year again?
This was between 2000 and 2005. And Professor Samir Brahmachari, who's also our mentor, was again a great support. He believed that, he gave the necessary push. And
Right.
remember, our budgets used to be very small. Just
Yeah.
to give you a context, as a PhD student, guess what my weekend job used to be on Saturdays?
Outside of the college?
No, very much in the lab,
As an extra.
not doing science. I used to actually
Wow.
wash. We all used to sit and wash our tips.
Wash the tips.
Tips for reusing in our experiments.
Wow.
So there was a
Wow.
protocol for that. You wash your tips, you boil them in double distilled water,
Right.
you boil them again in something else,
Right.
and then we would know whose tips are the best,
Wow.
who does the best job. So that's
I'm
the
sure
context.
people watching this, especially the younger ones, are probably thinking that they're so grateful today with the kind of things that they have around where they
Right.
can throw tips and not think about it again.
Right.
Wow, I can't imagine washing tips and then going back.
Reusing them, right?
That's crazy.
Different experiments we did. We continued the project we were doing in Quark Pharma at Kumar's lab in ISC.
Right.
And then Parag, unfortunately, he's no more. Dr. Parag Sadle gave us his loft to set up our first microarray scanner. Literally, it was the size of about 4x6, just enough for the scanner to sit there. And the Japanese guy who came to install it, he said, never, nowhere else in the world have we set up a lab like this, where we actually had to. So this is like a 300 kilo
Device.
scanner.
Yeah.
And it had to go up a
Wow.
steel staircase, which was like,
Wow.
you can imagine how
I
it
can
was.
imagine. I can. It's just
So,
taking the
so
turn.
we actually
Yeah.
cut down the steel staircase and lifted
Wow.
it up and then fixed it back again. So it was hilarious.
And this was all in IAC.
Yeah.
Wow. And you had to take permissions, of course.
course, yeah.
Do all of that.
Yeah.
Wow. I can't imagine. And that
Yeah.
was your first big capital equipment
So
for
no,
the company?
that's another good news, which is so early 2000s, 2003, 4, we were fortunate to get a project from AstraZeneca in India.
Right.
They had a R&D facility here, Dr. Bal Ganesh and his team. And we were trying to identify, so their program was to develop new drugs for TB.
Okay.
And we're looking at,
Out of India, but
yeah.
for across the world, basically. Right.
So they were trying to look at new targets. And so we got the project to do the bioinformatics component of it.
Okay.
And so, as an extension of that, one of the scientists wanted to they had an Affymetric system.
In AstraZeneca,
Yeah,
in the Bangalore facility.
right.
Okay.
But that was fixed. It was fixed for a certain organism, like
Okay.
human model systems. They didn't have anything for TB. And they reached out to us if we could do something for them. And so here we had this, remember the clone experiment,
Correct.
the
Which was already a
prime and kill.
method developed
Right.
a
So
few
that was
years
one
prior.
option.
Right.
Or, get something custom synthesized with, we didn't have the printers or anything. So I was looking around and I don't recall exactly how. There was this German guy, he said, you know what, I think Agilent has a fantastic chemistry and you should check it out for custom designs. And that was another breakthrough for us
And this
because
was like the
2005,
oligosynthesis or
yeah,
printing on the
inkjet printing.
just the printing, right?
Yeah. So they could synthesize any oligo print,
Right.
any oligo could be
Pretty much
printed.
it's like drop it, wash it,
Yeah.
then drop it again, wash it. Okay.
So that it so happened then that so we got in touch with Agilent and that relationship started to build. And one of our friends who was in Singapore also was in Agilent, so he sort of was the business end to things.
Right.
And we negotiated and got the scanner sort of on a let's test it out for 2 years, and if it works out, then we'll pay you for it.
2
So we didn't
years.
pay for it.
Wow, that's a bargain that I don't think anyone can
Yeah.
pull off now. Maybe 2 months, 3 months is what people allow,
Right.
but that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like I said, I think somewhere the connections helped,
Right.
somewhere friends came along, and Agilent was also not a very known name in genomics in India, so it was like a win-win for both of us.
Right.
And yeah, I think after we signed up with Agilent, the growth was sort of exponential after that.
And that was primarily your service business kicking
Right,
off,
right.
and more people asking for
Yeah.
work on that scanner.
Yeah, the good thing was that so while there was Affy and Illumina arrays,
Right.
customization was very expensive. They would only print 1,000 plus arrays, and in the
Right.
Indian context, nobody had a project of so many
Correct.
samples. Whereas Agilent was ready to print even one slide, custom slide.
Wow.
Right.
They were in a way startup. At least that division would
Yes,
have been like a
genomics
startup.
was early for them too.
Right.
Yeah.
And once this started, when did you move out of ISC? And
2005.
so in 5 years, then you sort of took your first office and
Yeah.
moved the 300 kg
Yes.
machine out.
Out. Yes.
Did you have to cut it again?
No, no. Bring it down was easier than going
That was
up.
easier. That
Yeah.
was easier. Right. And how many people were by then, by 2005? I'm imagining you already hired a lot of people.
We were still small, maybe about 8, 9 people.
8, 9 people.
Yeah.
And all of them joined and
Yeah. So mostly from IAC, right?
Right.
So people who had some molecular biology experience.
Right.
And of course, nobody knew genomics. We had to really train them from scratch.
genomics in 2003 or 2005 would have been almost rare and super niche, and maybe I'm assuming only limited to research and funded research through government institutions. At what point did you see it going into diagnostics, or at what point did you know that it will happen, or when was the time?
So microarrays for diagnostics started with what we call as the comparative genomic hybridization, right? Chromosomal microarrays, they used to call
Right.
them, right? So these early guys were Affymetrics,
Right.
and they still are. They do,
Right.
I think, take a large chunk of that business for diagnostics. So that was there to detect large chromosomal aberrations,
Right.
and then we started NGS in the late, say 2007, 8. We didn't have a sequencer yet, so
Correct.
we used to make libraries and had a partner in the US who would sequence it for
Okay.
us,
So
and
you
then
would
we would do
ship
the
the
analysis.
libraries out.
Yeah,
Right.
and then we would do the analysis for a couple of years. And early 2010, we got our first sequencer. I think that was the first commercial one in India.
Which, yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
So pretty much one of the first companies to bring it
Right.
into the country. Right.
So to answer your question, was it largely academic, researchers? The answer is yes,
In the
largely
beginning,
academic.
yes.
In India, I don't recall too many people using genomics for diagnostics until early 2013-14,
Wow.
which is when I think MedGenome came into play, and then Strand, of course, sort of from a bioinformatics company, they sort of
Strand story again was a little different, right? They sold software to
yeah,
Agilent,
yeah, for GeneSpring and
right? Which is the same Agilent. Of course, you're already
right,
friends with them by that point.
yeah.
So were you involved in something like that?
So we were their partner for global microarray designs,
Okay.
right? So for all of their customers, we used to do the microarray designs for them
Okay. So
for
every time they
Agilent.
wanted something custom,
Any
they would dial
customer of
you up, right?
Agilent, yeah, we would make the designs
Okay.
for them.
And eventually Strand somehow got into the software side of.
Right.
That's interesting, right? This is something that I'm sure probably 80, 90% or 95% of the audience may not know,
Yeah.
that you were doing the custom microarrays for Agilent,
Yeah.
and Strand managed or sold the software backend for a very big Agilent analysis
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
And that's two Indian companies in Bangalore within 20-kilometer
Yeah.
radius
Yeah.
and
Even
contributing
less. I
to.
think for some time they had their office in Sadashinagar,
Oh,
right at
wow.
that signal.
That's like 5 kilometers
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's crazy, right? Like how things work out.
Yeah.
If you look back, that's two companies contributing to a big chunk of their P&L or genomics P&L,
Yeah.
indirectly, of
Yeah.
course. And where we are now,
Yeah.
the world has changed so much. So that's awesome. So, uh, so the first diagnostic use cases, like you said, is early 2013, is what you think.
Yeah.
And did things change suddenly after that, or have you always seen that this growth has been predictable from where you stand?
Um, I think there was an inflection point. So 13-14 is when Illumina launched their sort of their diagnostic panels, right? So they had
Right,
something for cardio and then a couple of other
right,
diseases. So they wanted third-party validations of their arrays. So they had given us sort of they didn't call it a grant, but they gave us all of these reagents and
right.
sponsored the sequencing kind of cost.
Because you already had the sequencer,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course, right,
So that sort of kicked off the diagnostic sort of application for NGS. Although we were doing quite a number of projects on the research side, clinical research, right? More on the discovery. There
discovery
were,
more towards
ACTREC
the
was
drug
doing, yeah,
development,
what's happening with all my cancer samples. We were doing
right,
hundreds of arrays to
right,
understand that, or transcriptome sequencing. But per se, as a diagnostic assay, I think 2013-14 is when we saw it sort of beginning in India.
right. And then doctors started talking about it, or
No, it took
that was still took time?
Oh yeah, yeah, it took a long time, and I think
That's like the biggest,
yeah, yeah, we should probably credit MedGenome for sort of
right,
having that outreach, right?
right,
So significantly,
right.
a lot of work was done there. There's still a lot more work to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
done. I think we've probably touched 1 or 2% of the market.
Yeah. I don't think we hit the inflection point in terms of physicians and doctors adopting to it. That
Yeah,
is still, I think, yet to be.
it's there. It's
It's
there.
there.
It's a lot better than
Right,
when one started.
right,
But yeah, still some ways to go.
right. There are
Yeah.
things like, I was talking to one of the researchers uh, who was involved in psychiatry side of things, neural research, neurological sciences. So it's primarily on the mental health issues and diseases, right? There are drugs like SSRIs. Now, SSRIs don't really work the same way
Yeah.
on everyone.
Yeah.
And there's a big element of pharmacogenetics that can directly apply.
Yeah.
But when I look at cancer,
Hmm.
at least we know, like there's a lot of talk about how many panels are there,
Yeah.
how many short panels, long panels, panels specific to lung or panels for pan cancer.
Yeah.
But there is no such talk on the neurological conditions
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are more.
Yeah.
There are other parts of the human body that require being taken care of, and I'm sure drugs don't work the same way.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at things like that, right, the whole pharmacogenetics element, which I think marries your genetics
Yeah.
on the diagnostics use case and what doctors care about as a fundamental thing. How far do you think we are from a day where pretty much 80% of all ailments will require a doctor to look at a genetic report?
In India, it's quite some time away.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think it's already in a good place in some parts of the world?
Yes and no. So there are two or three components, right? So there is your rare disease diagnostics, which
Right.
I think is fairly well established in terms of using it as a tool for diagnosis of a disease or reconfirmation
Right.
or predicting a certain risk. That's already in place. Like you said, in cancer, oncology, they know how to use this,
Right.
and it is in practice, it is in use. Even if it's 1%,
Right.
at least it's, it's. Whereas for pharmacogenomics, somehow people have not perceived it as a necessity,
Hmm.
simply because when you fit in a certain guideline, right? So, for example, we do a lot of testing for the organ transplant patients, right? So, tacrolimus is a drug that's given, say, renal transplant, and then maintenance is tacrolimus. And depending on what CYP mutation you have, you could either metabolize it quickly or
Right.
not at all. And so there are guidelines how you can dose tacrolimus based on the SNPs that one has.
Right.
So that is a test people are using because there's a understanding, there is a need, and people are doing. But for many others, there isn't. And one of the few things I'm always perplexed by is especially the neuropsychiatry,
Right.
because it's quite a challenging area where typically these drugs take at least 4 to 6 weeks to
Start
act, right?
showing
Up.
some changes.
And
Yes.
first of all, getting a neuropsychiatric patient onto therapy is challenging for families.
Right.
And then you wait for 4 or 6 weeks, not knowing whether the drug will work
It's
or
done
not.
anything or not? Yeah.
Yeah, it should technically be mandatory that
Right.
you sort of test, but I don't think we're there, and I'm not sure why there is a sort of reluctance to either there is a trust factor or not enough evidences to show that somebody did this and the success rate was this, just like they
Right.
do for IVF, for example,
Right.
Doing embryo screening increases my success rate.
Right.
There are evidences now. There's enough
Right.
statistical.
I think in that way, do you think it's fundamentally market driven? Because when you said IVF, suddenly the first thing I could think of was today there are more people in India even who one can afford those procedures and are really really needing
Yeah.
such things,
Yeah.
and the sheer volume of people that will end up requiring things automatically made the whole industry more smarter, more sophisticated, and everyone's looking to push the tech usage. But maybe some diseases are not there yet, and then you have the whole taboo of a lot of people not even showing up
Yeah.
in front of doctors in case of neuropsychiatry.
Absolutely.
So do you think it's fundamentally market driven like any other business in the world, or
It can't just be market driven.
right.
It probably
It
starts
shouldn't
there.
be
Yeah,
also,
it
I think.
starts there maybe, but then if people don't see, if a user or a patient doesn't see the utility
Right.
in the long term, IVF people have seen success,
Right.
where no other option was available, and so it sort of gets stamped as an acceptable sort of option,
Right.
despite its costs and other things.
So it's evidence.
Yeah.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
And how do doctors at least, the beginning, the starting points of all these things, right? Doctors who prescribe these tests, how do you think they even get educated about things like these? These are rapidly changing. It's not like they have time to look through
Yeah.
research papers.
Yeah.
Of course, some of that falls on companies like us, to go there and sort of educate
Talk
them.
to them. Yeah.
But what do you think is their primary uh, sort of input of information, or where do you think they get these things from, apart from corporates like us?
I think there are these mandatory CMEs that people have to attend, and then what happens is there. I think to some extent there is a market-driven push in the
Right.
sense patients ask.
Oh, right.
Right. So in
Educated,
our
informed patients,
yeah in
basically.
our domain, for example, about 5% of the cases are self-prescribed, as
Oh,
in
wow.
there's a risk in the family. I want to know what's my risk, or getting married what's likely the risk if I have a baby. So that is coming from an understanding and knowledge. And then, so when that comes from a patient, there's a push for the clinician to adapt
Makes
these
sense.
things.
Started in the beginning. That's how we started this
Yeah.
podcast. So you've moved. You've built one of the largest service businesses in the genomic space. Most of your work was in R&D, and you worked with pretty much central and state governments
Yeah.
based on the funding ecosystem. And now, 2024, where you have multiple companies, it's a group of
Yeah.
companies, right? And some of them are even getting into products. So how did this whole thing evolve, and what do you think is the next step for your group of companies, and what's your big most exciting thing that you're looking forward to?
So remember when we actually came back to India, the idea was to start um, developing these products. And of
Right.
course, we didn't have the capital to do it.
Right.
And the very logical way of going ahead with a company was by doing services,
Right.
right? Somebody would pay for it. And also COVID was another sort of eye opener, which sort of brought out all the sort of weaknesses of the system in India. If you
And the
look at,
gaps basically.
yeah, if you look at NGS, we have nothing at all in terms of technology here,
Right.
right? And so what we're trying to do now is, if not the technology of sequencing itself, can we build the ecosystem of products around that, which can be local rather
Right.
than having to import everything,
Right.
right? 95% of the things for NGS are imported.
Pretty
And
much.
yeah, so that's the idea, and that's where all our product development is focused on at
Right.
Genotypic at the moment.
So everything
Bringing in,
except the flow cell.
yeah,
Everything
flow cell
outside the
or the
flow cell.
sequencing reagent.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Anything that the box does, we cannot interfere with.
Right.
But before that,
And
for
after.
post like
Right.
data analysis, we have a software tool, and we're looking at better, configurations of compute systems which are very specific to genomics.
Right.
So that's the exciting part at the moment.
Right.
The other exciting part of the story has also been this idea of democratizing sequencing, which we've partnered with Nanopore on.
Right.
There's an alignment in our thinking there, and which is making anybody set up a genomics lab. Like during COVID, we set up almost 100 plus labs, right?
Wow.
And these were, trust me, labs which had never seen PCR. Was new to them, right? PCR,
Yeah.
they had been forced by the government, all the
Right.
ICMR labs, that they should do RT-PCR.
Right.
And in a span of 48 hours, we were able to train them, get a successful run, and give them the confidence that they
Next
can do
lab.
it. Yeah, and that's been a very
Right.
remarkable thing.
So my understanding comes from talking to physicians, doctors, researchers primarily, and of course molecular diagnostic lab heads.
Yeah.
I've basically listed out my ICP to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are the things that they're talking about and asking us also. So we always find ourselves as marketing and sales people representing a molecular diagnostics company. When we face these people in their chambers, in their labs, uh, beyond usual stuff, which is our product, what we do,
Yeah.
and what they're doing, the conversations usually end up going into these areas of interest, and there's a lot to learn from them. And sometimes they also ask us questions that we sort of carry with us, ask the next person in the
Yeah.
meeting, and then ends up coming back in circle and answering them, because hey, you asked me about this last time, this is what I heard.
Yeah.
And that's been the learning, and that's how at least some of these questions have come from that learning. One of the, again, popular questions that I get out of such meetings is that genomics, in some use cases, which is like say NIPT, this was a counterintuitive almost. One question from my end was, can you do things like NIPT in say RT-PCR or DD-PCR
Yeah.
even? Uh, and of course, we know that it's happening in NGS. It's been popularized in India. A lot of people offer it as a test. And isn't it more convenient or cheaper or more accessible to
Yeah.
patient if you were to do it in RT-PCR or DD-PCR? And one of the things that I get back from some of these lab heads is that sequencing is just as economical
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
compared to what it was. I would rather just look at the whole thing.
Yeah.
And that was like a revelation for me. So uh, the price is not always about bringing down from where it is, but price is also about what the patient can afford to pay and what value
Yeah.
they get out of the system. Now, while we are there with NIPT, I don't think, or this is a question to you, do you think we are there for cancer or oncology in general?
I think we are.
We are.
Yeah.
So you think more panels are being run over RT-PCR or
Yes.
specific
So it's
biomarkers?
again like you said, the use case, right? So what am I doing the test for? Right? When I don't know and I want to ask what is there, then you're better off doing an NGS panel. Whereas, let's take for example, you've heard of liquid biopsies, right?
Right.
So you're looking at minimal residual disease.
Right.
And if one were to say that I want to track how the patient is responding, so I have this original mutation profile, so I take a couple of those markers and then I track the presence of that in the patient over the course of the treatment.
And
So
this
you're
could
better off
be
doing PCR,
RT-PCR, right?
just do plain PCR. But
Right.
for the first point, when you don't know what you have to look for,
Hmm.
that's when you would do it, yes.
So
You don't know
once in
which
the
mutation
beginning
it is,
of your
yes.
planning,
Right,
basically.
right. And sometimes it also saves you time and when you want to know, let's say you have 6 or 7 genes that you really want to ask which one of these does the patient have, and then you make a decision on the treatment. You just do all of them because it's affordable, right?
Now,
Instead of doing one
more
by
so.
one. Yeah.
And I think India, it's more affordable than anywhere else in the
It is.
world.
It's the cheapest
It
because
is, yeah.
the reason I'll tell you it's
Right.
cheapest is because I think our regulatory costs are minimal. So if you look at the US, while your actual assay cost, I mean, by assay cost, I'm just talking about the laboratory workflow,
Right.
says $100 or $200, but the final price to the patient is a couple of $1,000. And that,
And then not paid by them
yeah.
in most cases. Do you think that is enabling it to stay there? The fact that insurances pay for it is why they are still affording that high price?
Yeah.
And that's really the reason.
Yeah. And also the fact that it's sort of more accepted and has become more routine
Right.
than it is in India.
More people are more aware
Yeah.
in general. And you said something interesting earlier. You said 5% of your patients or your sequencing
Yeah.
requests
Yeah.
are still from the patient side,
Yeah.
initiated from their end. Do you think it's much higher in the US that way?
Um, Not likely. I think in the US, it's harder to go and ask for a test to be done.
Ah, you're right.
Yeah.
Correct.
So,
I don't think they have control.
yeah.
It's still the physician who has to take a call.
Yeah. In Europe, for example, for any genetic testing, even before a doctor can prescribe it, you have to go through sort of a genetic counseling. Your case has to be evaluated as being eligible or not for genetic testing.
And then still government pays for it. So
Yeah.
there are checks in places.
Yeah.
And now coming back to where we are in India today, insurance is still evolving.
Yeah.
There's a lot more room for growth in that segment as a whole. Of course, there's value in doing these things. That's why insurance has picked it up
Yeah.
in other parts of the world. So when do you think we will get into a similar situation, or do you think we will ever get into that situation where insurances start paying for most of the genetic tests?
In some cases, they have paid for some of our patients.
In
Right?
India also?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great to hear
Yeah.
actually.
I don't know if it was because it was camouflage as any some other test, but it
Okay.
got paid. But I think it will be covered. In fact, it's a worry if it's covered by insurance, simply because one could become discriminatory. Just like if you have any prior illness, your premium goes up, or sometimes some of them don't even get insurance, health insurance, right? So,
The moment you know.
yeah, some cardiac, you've had some issue, then you either are not eligible for some kinds of insurance or your premium is so high
Yeah.
you'd rather say if I fall sick I'll pay for it than have an insurance.
Right. I think getting ahead of ourselves that way could be a problem
Yeah.
in India as a setting that we are in. And ESIC government scenario again is not totally evolved. So people still, there are people who don't fall between this or that.
Yeah.
Like people, there's a big segment of like people in general who don't fall under ESIC because of that salary
Yeah.
thing,
Correct.
and they also can't afford expensive or higher health covers, so they're always stuck in that gap in between. So yeah, that's an entire, I think, episode if you want to talk
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
insurance.
Absolutely.
But it's an evolving story, and we should also be involved as much as we can in the growth of that.
Yeah.
So interestingly, I don't know if you've seen on the way, there's an even office on this road, not this road, sorry, that was the other road.
Mm.
Have you heard of even
Yeah.
as a company?
Yeah.
So are you using it?
No.
So it sounds like an even endorsement. It's not, but we use it. So I'm trying to understand how these modern insurance companies are working. Like, so again, this is like a digital product. It We all have apps at Cambrian, so all of us are sort of covered under even insurance over and above typical insurance. So the reason we do that is because IPD is covered, small things like diagnostics is covered.
I see.
Interestingly, mental health therapy
Mm-hmm.
sessions are covered.
Mm.
So it's a personal thing for me to sort of see if these things are being used.
Mm.
As founders, we initiate things, but it's nice to see if people actually used
Use them.
some of
Mm.
these perks.
Mm.
And our premium has been going up every year by double digit percentage
Wow.
numbers, and it's a good thing to see.
Mm.
Like it's good to see that people are actually using. I've seen a lot of people use the therapy sessions.
Mm.
I've seen people use dermatology
Mm.
sessions also through
Mm.
IPD.
Mm.
And while that whole segment is growing, I'm always itching to sort of go and talk to the event team or more teams like that in general, and directly start this conversation about genomics
Yeah.
or genetic testing,
Yeah.
screening, oncology screening, which is again a very, very big segment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen Nikhil Kamath just posted a big thing, and now it's everywhere.
Yeah.
For us, it's a lot more relevant because we know
Yeah.
those numbers. Those numbers go into our presentations
Yeah.
to our audience or our investors, and it's nice to see that on a very big public platform, and everyone now is talking the same numbers. I don't know, maybe if he's secretly investing in Dhiti Omics or
No.
so that's why he's.
Haven't met him yet, but
So I'm sure something's happening. Like I'm sure maybe he's found a investment in the whole oncology care
yeah.
segment or screening segment, but we should talk about it, right? So let's say breast cancer or lung cancer now, things that could be detected early
Yeah.
uh, and should be detected early. What is the role of genomics or RT-PCR or molecular diagnostics as a piece? And are we in a good place in India, or what should we do to get to that place?
So if you look at, do we have the technologies to do it? The answer is yes.
Right.
Yeah, in India too, for early detection of cancer. Also validated for diagnostic use.
Right.
Now, how much is it in use? It's very, very early times, right? Because just like IVF, the story I said, it's early times, and people need to see that. So, for example, Grail has not been a great story, right? So, which was purported to be the sort of
Holy
test.
Grail.
Yeah, exactly. So in any evolution of technology, these things happen. There are ups and downs, and then it will stabilize. And my thinking is in a few years, this will stabilize. But we're getting there, right, in terms of early screening.
Like I've heard of one story in that PET scan area, right? There's a hospital in Mangalore. Um, they actually imported one of the PET scan machines. Again, super expensive, very big capital expense, multiple crores involved. Apparently, they station an engineer. Again, this is in Mudbidri.
Yeah.
Mudbidri is not really.
A town.
It's a town. It's not even Mangalore, right? It's an hour or more away from the airport. They stationed one engineer in that town only to maintain the PET scan machine.
Mm.
And apparently, it gets used so often and so aggressively, and people are always in the queue that they almost end up maintaining it on a weekly basis.
Mm-hmm.
There are parts that are always in stock in Mudbidri, and the engineer sort of replaces
Fixes it.
them, makes it okay, and lets it run. Now that's crazy to hear, right? Like something like that, which is so much in demand,
Yeah.
is still not omnipresent. I wouldn't say it's very easy to access PET scan. It's an ordeal.
Yeah.
It's expensive. It's 20,000-30,000 rupees
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
That's still a big number. It's not something that you can just write and expect everyone to sort of go through it. And I think we are in the same place.
Yeah.
If you have to do a screening, I think it's 20, 30,
Yeah.
40,000
Yeah.
rupees. Yeah. I think there will be a time when that sort of comes down.
Yeah,
And
but if you look at it as a relative cost of the entire um, cancer therapy, so anyone who's diagnosed with cancer, depending on the stage and whatever, can, with the lowest cost being say 5 to 6 lakhs, to it can go upwards of a crore or more if you're doing
right.
targeted therapies. So if you look at that, in the context of if I'm spending say 15 lakh rupees for my treatment, I want to
Shouldn't you
be at
know?
least
Yeah.
reasonably sure that
Right.
it will be well spent
Right.
and have a higher degree of success. Not just for the sake of money, but if you have access to a technology that will cost you say 30,000 rupees in your 15 lakhs, that can reasonably assure you of being having a precise treatment.
The direction you're
Yeah,
going in. And I've seen, so this is again a very different look at hospitals as an industry. We've recently been to Bangkok for a medical expo. I know it does not sound like it's reality, but there was a medical expo 2 3 weeks ago, and me, Vaibhav, Raghav, we went there primarily for that. The moment we entered the airport in Bangkok, and before we sort of exit the last gate, we've seen a big kiosk maintained by Bumram Grad hospitals.
I see.
So that's literally an entire kiosk managed by a hospital to receive patients
Hmm.
who sort of come into city to get.
Or medical tourism kind of thing.
Exactly. So it's their dedicated kiosk for patients who sort of sign up for certain procedure or a treatment there, and if they're coming through airport, so they get picked up there, and there's a concierge service, and you should see the actual hospital. It's like it's better than 5 star
I see.
hotels and whatnot. Multiple floors, 20-floor hospital, two branches I think across the town, and it's really really so professionally and so maintained like a big hospitality ecosystem that I'm sure like tests and money is not a thing for people who go through those situations. And I don't see that level of uh, adoption of tech and the adoption of customer care or patient care being available in India because of
Yeah.
sheer numbers. We just
Right.
too many patients to the number of
Yeah.
hospitals that we have. But also we're consolidating. Groups are eating
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
groups and sort of
Becoming
becoming one,
larger. Yeah.
larger and larger. When do you think there will be a point where most physicians, or at least oncology, let's say, let's just talk about cancer care, do you think there will be a scenario where almost all or majority of cancer care centers where the doctors talk to the patients have access to a sequencer in the next room? Do you think that scenario will happen?
Yeah, I think so.
And they
It's
will
it's
try.
already happening.
Right.
Yeah, it's already happening. And if you want to see how a cancer hospital is evaluated, right? Typically, what do patients look for when they choose a hospital for their treatment is, of course, the doctor or the oncologist who's going to take care of them, and what facilities do these centers have. And while it's now in the realm of diagnostics, right? So NGS sequencers are with diagnostic companies,
Correct.
not necessarily inside a hospital.
Correct.
Um, but if the volumes are rising as they are, it quite likely will be sitting in a hospital. I mean, you have these, for example, the neurological tumors, right? So I'm not sure you've seen that story from Nanopore.
Not yet.
Couple of hours while the patient was in surgery, they resected, sequenced. The surgeon took a decision on how to proceed with the surgery based on NGS
Wow.
data while the patient was sort of,
On the table, on the surgery table.
yeah.
And I think we should hear more stories and sort of
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
go
And
in
that's
that
what
direction.
democratizing
Right.
sequencing is all about. And
Exactly.
yeah,
So while you can still do majority heavy lifting of majority of the operations remotely
yeah,
because data analysis,
Yeah.
turning that into a report is still a large
Yeah.
piece of that puzzle.
Right.
The wet lab part is still manageable.
I think that has really sort of seen a lot of improvement or technology leaps, the lab part of it.
Right.
Sequencers have, when we had our first sequencer, we could decide how many bases. We used to literally fill bottles with reagents
Oh.
and put them in. And now it's all cartridges,
Plug and play.
spewing out, and then until your VCF, everything is automated.
Right. And there's still, I would say, it's still not enough because you still need to analyze, sort of
So the
turn that into a report.
current specialization is in the variant interpretation rather than just getting to the point of a variant.
Right.
That's pretty much sort of automated. Of course, there is always a deterrent of your heavy investments in these machines,
Right.
but technology is there. And I think the specialization is now only in the variant interpretation.
Kind of sort of just end with a few points. What are the key areas in genomics that AI is directly impacting, and what should people look out for?
Yeah, so if you recall a few minutes ago, I mentioned variant interpretation is still,
Right.
I think that's where it'll make a big difference. Um, we're looking at things that the human brain sometimes cannot perceive, right? So data that can large amount patterns that one can recognize or associations that one as a human being could potentially miss. AI could catch it,
Right.
and um, I think it'll. So we've moved from somebody physically manually pipetting things to a
Hmm.
machine doing a lot of the
Right.
wet work, and then there was automation of the primary analysis
Right.
with all these NVIDIA and Dragon kind of
Right.
equipment. And now I think the next phase will be that beyond that, it just becomes just spit your saliva into a tube and then you have your report in like a few hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the last piece of this episode will, I want to primarily ask you about, uh, you've been supporting a lot of startups through your venture on independent capacity as well, and you've supported us as well when we sort of just came into the real world from our research labs and sort of got into the commercial world. You were one of the first ones to validate CamSelect. I don't know if you remember,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
almost 2.5 3 years
Yeah.
ago, and you're still a customer. You still consume that one product and couple of others. You spend a lot of time, I think, on mentoring such stories. So can you talk a little bit about that, and if you want to mention a few startups,
That
a shout out to them. It
yeah,
helps them also get some traction.
yeah. I think the first one that we sort of, or Dhiti that happened was Varsha's lab. Varsha was,
Okay.
I don't know if
Varsha
you know her,
Sudhir, right?
Ramki, RK and Varsha, husband
Okay.
and wife team. Yeah, so she had a molecular diagnostic lab. They came back from the US and they were trying to set up some diagnostics for HIV. So she, of course, she did all her RT-PCR work at Dhiti. So she was the first company, sort of officially in that
Okay.
sense, who incubated. And that was just largely using the infrastructure because she didn't want to set up a lab
Right.
immediately. And then, of course, we did some validations for you. We've had quite a number of our ex-employees who've gone on to become entrepreneurs.
Right.
I think automation in many of these lab processes have been instrumental in sort of bringing two things. One is uniformity and scale and speed. So if you see, while we might have taken a few years to get to that point, training people and all that, this is the early times, to how the newer companies have been able to jumpstart is largely driven by automation. We also saw that with COVID, for example, right, where the nucleic acid extraction component, people were doing thousands of assays, and that would have taken a couple of hours, suddenly became just a 10-minute, automated extraction. And what you guys at Cambrian have done is sort of a great thing because I think that's still going to be a great contributor to the overall scale of these technologies in diagnostic labs, where you don't expect them to be trained in
Right.
the molecular aspects, but it just ensures a certain standardized output and scale to any scale lab. That's great thing from Cambrian, and we've loved being part of the small part of that with your
You're a
validations.
big part, trust me. During the thick middle of COVID, I think we've managed to achieve quite a lot together.
So those are little things that we're happy to help as infrastructure support to startups. Um, Many of them, and Manoj's company, Algorithmics, we've collaborated with him, discussing possible applications for the pooling and testing
Right,
in the biological domain. He's a
right,
mathematics guy, and we are
right,
biologists. So essentially, conversations to see
right,
what could emerge from the confluence of these two,
right,
right? So that's been exciting, and I always go back to our startup days and how much
right.
support we got, and I think it's like karma, right? You give it back.
Awesome. And a big thank you for being part of this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and it felt like it should be three more episodes at least. But because of how much time we've set for this one particular thing, and sort of concluded at our AI, so it's like a good cliffhanger for the next episode. So I think we'll speak more about AI hopefully in a couple of weeks, and maybe we'll bring in more people and actually make it a larger conversation. I'm actually very keen on talking to you and Manoj together at the same time, because I've spoken to him last time. uh, it's a crazy conversation. We went from geometry to math to algorithms, and how all of that comes back to biology. So I'm looking forward to actually a lot more episodes like this. And thank you for supporting in the beginning, and also thank you for continuing to support this
Yep.
way. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me around on this first episode. A privilege to be part of that. And yeah, look forward to more conversation with engineers and mathematicians.
Awesome. So that marks the end of one of the first few episodes of Beyond the Bench again. If you've liked what you've seen so far, and if what we talk about resonated well with you, please like and subscribe, and of course share it with your colleagues. We would love to build a space where molecular biologists, people involved in genomics across all domains, which is R&D, sales and businesses, to gain some sort of value from this podcast. If you have ideas on what we should be talking about next, please do put that on the comments below. And more than anything, thank you so much for staying till the end of the episode and watching all of this. Looking forward to a lot more episodes with you.